I'd like to use my last chance to address this very pleasant audience that I've enjoyed being with this week. In summary, obviously I cannot respond fully to the interesting remarks made about the Pope or clerical celibacy. I'd like to look at something more fundamental. Why will my remarks, all the eloquence of which I am capable, why will they not convince Elder Brown in the slightest? I poured on all my charm and wit, all my knowledge. It has not had the slightest effect. If I came up with some argument he hadn't thought of before, for example, some new insight, something that he hadn't met in these debates, do you think he would become a Catholic on the spot? I hadn't thought of that. Let's cancel the debates for the rest of the week. I've changed my mind. I'm going to become a Catholic. No. If he heard something he hadn't heard before, he wouldn't say, oh, my system's wrong. He would say, I have to reflect more upon it. Here's an element I hadn't thought of, but I'm sure I can find something in my system that's going to account for this particular element. The notion of tradition that I had last night, for example, seemed to be one such thing. If he couldn't come up with it himself, he has friends, the scripture he can ponder. In other words, he has a system that is capable of a certain flexibility, that incorporate new ideas, and any challenge to it, unexpected, isn't going to make him surrender it. And you've probably seen, too, that he hasn't had much of an effect on me. He's very clever, wonderful rhetoric, a command of the Bible that is staggering. He's heard a lot of ideas, or he's presented ideas that I haven't heard before. It set me scrambling, I can tell you. Did I abandon Catholicism, fall on my knees, seeking membership in the Church of Christ? No, I was a little frustrated perhaps, disappointed with myself, wishing I had been able to be quicker on my feet or something like that. Look for advice from somebody, talk it over. In other words, I too feel that I have a system which is large and complete, flexible and vast. So argumentation based on mere logic isn't always successful. And if I had one criticism to make of Mr. Brown in my tentative way, caution, I would say that I feel that he confuses logic with truth. Because something can be logically demonstrated, and he's demonstrated that frequently this week, it must be true. But it's the other way around. Truth is logical. If something is true, it will be logical. But not every logical position is necessarily true. I've met atheists who are much cleverer than I, who can argue better than I, who can flummox me. St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, said that there are two reasons to be an atheist. If you boil them all down, and my experience has confirmed that. The first is the problem of evil. How can a good God allow evil? And as a priest, I have encountered that excruciating pain that people who, say, suffer the loss of a child. It's very hard to find an answer. There are answers, but suddenly they seem to have the bottom drop out when you meet someone grieving, truly grieving. And the other reason for being an atheist is that God is superfluous. We can account for everything by evolution or something like that. The first then would be the personal element. The second would be the more theoretical. It's very hard to argue against that. There are arguments. There are logical arguments, but they do not necessarily convince. Or think of the great religious systems of the world. I taught a course on Islam. Islam has a perfect answer to every Christian objection. The position of Islam is that the Jews corrupted their revelation. Christ came, a great prophet in their eyes, and gave a revelation that the Christians corrupted. God finally intervened to give Muhammad the definitive revelation. And the miracle is that he was an illiterate who wrote the greatest work in Arab literature. So anything I say, they would say, well, that's an instance where you went wrong. And how do you know? We have the miracle of the Quran. It's a complete system. I had a Muslim student in the class, as a matter of fact, and she could explain in perfect detail, very convincingly, the whole Muslim system. Or Buddhism, or Hinduism. These are great religions that have been in existence for thousands of years. There must be something about them that satisfies the religious instinct. And as I say, it's very difficult to find a hole in the argument. I think if you're going to refute another system, you don't necessarily do it by logic. Oh, maybe you could. Please don't think that I'm denying logic. But the logic would be so tortuous and so unconvincing, as Mr. Brown and I have both exhibited this week, that you would have very small chance of success. The personal convictions, the allegiances, the personal history, the satisfaction with, say, a form of religion, these are very difficult to move by a mere logical argument. It requires a sea change, a basic attitude alteration. No, I would say that the best way to refute another person's wrong position is to try to expand his view, to show that the difference is not so much based on logic, but on comprehension, the range of reality included. So I find the atheist, for example, living in a very small universe. It's a very boring universe where nothing happens. There's no freedom, there's no God, if you really push it, there's no such thing as virtue. It may be defensible, but who wants to live in such a universe when you can have a universe which is infused with the presence of God? So my appeal to the atheist is not to batter him to the ground with logic. I don't think he would succeed. The atheists I know tend to beat me, as Mr. Brown, I'm sure, would readily agree. But the range, the satisfaction, the beauty of Christianity, the full reality of the person enriched by Christianity. Oh, it's logical, I don't deny that, and it can be defended logically, but it's much more than that. It's a way of life. It's a worldview that is comprehensive and complete. It is wonderful. G.K. Chesterton, who is no slouch in logic, pointed out that reason by itself is madness. In fact, he had a typically clever quip. He said, the madman is not the man who's lost his reason. The madman is the man who's lost everything except his reason. And some of my best friends are crazy. Literally, I'm not kidding. I never win an argument with them. They have a worldview which is complete. Chesterton's example is the paranoid. Everyone's out to get me. And you say, oh no, they're not even looking at you. His reply is, aren't they clever? It's very hard to argue with a madman. He has a worldview, but it's a very tiny view. The best way to break him loose is to say, who are you? Look at the world, look at the universe, look at yourself. You're consumed with this monomania. Expand your view. Think of poetry. Poets don't go mad. Think of beauty, think of the universe, think of history. Get a hobby, do something to break out of the shell of your madness. So that is the idea, excuse me. My reply, therefore, to Elder Brown, my basic reply that I've tried unsuccessfully to put across, is that I reject the Church of Christ and I prefer Catholicism because I find Catholicism much larger. As a Catholic, I can look upon the entire history of the Christian Church, and I can find something good in everything. There are things I can admire in the Protestant religion, because the Protestant religion, although it broke away from the church, if I may use that phrase, wasn't washed overboard, shall we say, with nothing. It had the Bible. And I'm impressed by what the Protestant church has made of the Bible. I have many relatives who are not Catholics, who are Protestants. And what they have done with the Bible shames me, who have not only the Bible, but the full Catholic tradition and the full range of sacramental life. I can look upon the great saints and convince myself, yes, that Christianity really does work. It is possible to be a Christian with the help of the Spirit, but, of course, with the help of God's grace and His favor. But it is possible. And I need that assurance because I look at myself and I see a failed human being with the Spirit not bringing the fruits as he should. I look at St. Augustine, and I was wounded by the remark made about St. Augustine last night. St. Augustine was a genius, and he was the most sincere man that we can know. And if you I can't believe that Mr. Brown is read very widely in St. Augustine, because you cannot read that man and come away unaffected. His view was dark. His view makes the facile optimism of some Christians seem trivial. Even, to me, the entire Orthodox tradition, which is very optimistic about man and his powers, seems to shrink or lose some of its appeal when I read Augustine's somber view of the human condition. And he knew what he was speaking about. And yet, he is considered to be one of the greatest geniuses the world has ever seen, a self-taught African. And what wonders he wrote. I teach a course in the Trinity. And one of the authors, a modern author, has said, Augustine's work on the Trinity is the greatest work ever written on the Trinity, including all modern works. And the profound sublimity of Augustine's search for God, only to fall back before the divine reality in humble adoration, realizing that although we can find elements of the divine throughout the world, in creation, within the human person, and in Scripture, the Church, given to us by the Church, nevertheless, the divine reality must exceed. And yet, what a glorious failure. His Confessions, too, a protracted commentary on the book of Genesis, where his life is seen as unfolding the mystery in this specific instance of what God began when he created the world and the human beings in it. The city of God, too, a theology of history. So I can read those men. If I can give my own paradox in a Chestertonian fashion, open to misinterpretation perhaps, but I would say I'd rather be wrong with St. Augustine than right with Mr. Brown. What do I mean by that? I mean that Augustine's vast system is not one that the Church has fully accepted. And therefore, Augustine must be monitored. He is a Christian. In fact, he said that himself at the opening of his great book on the Trinity. If I have erred, correct me. But if I have said the truth, profit from it. If you can do better, improve it. If I have erred, correct me. But his system, his view, his understanding of the human condition, his transparent honesty, his absolute commitment to Christ, his love of his neighbor, his powers of prayer, the philosophy that he gives, all of these things put me in the presence of a great mind who has been more influential in forming Catholicism and Protestantism than anyone else except the Bible itself. So when I read that, I feel myself in contact with a thinker who drew upon his own tradition and continues it. When John Henry Newman was considering what church he should join, how he should express his faith in God, for to lose his Anglican faith was not to make him a Catholic, he spent years studying Scripture and the Church. A man of fastidious taste and great intellectual powers. And when he wrote to his friends to tell them that he decided to become a Catholic, he didn't describe it in terms of argument. Why did he become a Catholic? Well, he put it in a phrase that appeals to me very much with my admiration for what the early church represents. He said, I became convinced that if Athanasius, the hero of Nicaea, and Ambrose, the great church statesman, if they were to travel north to Trier, which they both visited in the 4th century, and continue north to a wooded town in England by the name of Oxford, they would not attend worship in the great cathedrals. They would find a side alley and join the tiny Catholic population that worshiped in Oxford at that time. And Newman simply wanted to be with them. And when I read Newman, as I've read over and over again, the music of his prose, one writer said, is radioactive. It springs from the page as if it were alive, no matter how dusty the book. And I have the same reality. I want to be in the same church as he is. A great thinker who recognized the limits of argumentation. I mentioned his university sermons. The paradox is that he argues with the most compelling logic that logic is limited. That logic is part of the human person, that faith is logical, but faith does not depend upon logic. If faith were merely the conclusion of reason, in what way, he says, would it be novel and strange? I look at Thomas Aquinas as well. And once again, I could expatiate in my emotional way about the power of his prose. And what Thomas Aquinas did was to take the biblical tradition, the original form of the gospel, Old and New Testament. He examined how it flowered in the early church, the patristic period as it's called, the Church of the Fathers, how that patristic period was faithful to the gospel in expressing it in the cultural dress of the Roman Empire without sacrificing its vitality. And he took those two traditions and he expanded them, he expressed them in a new culture, because a new civilization had appeared by the time Thomas Aquinas wrote in the 13th century. A new civilization, which was Christian Europe. And he was able to express the Christian truth in that new cultural form. And that is a great achievement. The adventure of the church today is to repeat that experiment. The church, in its difficulties today, is experiencing a desire to re-express the gospel in a way that modern men and women can understand. What are the characteristics of our society? Democracy, the technology, the rise of science, the smallness of the world by modern means of communication, both physical and electronic, the breakup of the family. These are all elements of our society that require the gospel. But the gospel must speak in a language that can be understood. The church, after the Vatican Council, is engaged in the great adventure of an Athanasius, of a Thomas Aquinas, of an Augustine, to re-express the gospel for the people. And we believe as Catholics that we can face any culture, and guided by the Spirit, that we can recognize and confirm what is good in that culture and discard what is evil. That is the power of the assimilation of the Catholic Church. And therefore, in America of the 21st century, the Church can speak to the people in a language they can understand without compromising in any way the gospel as it has been lived in the early period of the Church, definitive in so many ways for our worship and our creed, in the period of the Middle Ages, which saw another tremendous flowering of the human spirit. It can speak in the same way to the people today. That's what it is to be guided by the Spirit. The Catholic principle, therefore, is the Bible, the Christian inheritance, the gospel in its fullness, is so rich in meaning that it can never be exhausted. Everyone is called upon, every culture is called upon, every institution is called upon to exhibit in some wonderful way what the gospel means. There will be no end of books, as John said, because this progresses. And if I could close on a sour note, it seems to me that the Church of Christ, from what I've been able to learn this week by reading and by listening to Mr. Brown, has also succeeded in speaking to the American people of today. It's a church that's based upon a biblical text that everybody can read, which therefore requires inexpensive Bibles, widely disseminated. Is it a church that uses all the modern means of communication? Is it a church that speaks to America as it is? But I find without the element of tradition, it is simply too small. And therefore I invite you all to join me in a church which is large. Thank you very much for being a good audience.